Hello, everyone. So we are going to pick up where we left off. Charmaine stood up and walked about, causing Waif to roll to her feet and watch inquiringly, while the king limped over to the bell rope by the door. He was decidedly frail, Charmaine thought, and very tall. It was as if his height was too much for him. While they waited for someone to answer the bell, Charmaine seized the chance to look at the books in the shelves. They seemed to be books about everything, higgledy-piggledy, travel books next to books of algebra and poems rubbing shoulders with geography. Charmaine had just opened one called The Secrets of the Universe Revealed when the library door opened and a man in a tall cook's hat came in carrying a tray. To Charmaine's surprise, the king nimbly skipped behind the table. "My dear, pick up your dog," he called out urgently. Another dog had come in, pressed close to the cook's legs as if it felt unsafe. A bitter-looking brown dog with gnarly ears and a ratty tail. It was growling as it came. Charmaine had no doubt that this was the dog that slew other dogs, and she dove to pick Waif up. But Waif somehow slipped through her hands and went trotting towards the cook's dog. The other dog's growls increased to a snarl. Bristles rose along its haggard brown back. It looked so menacing that Charmaine did not dare go any nearer to it. Waif, however, seemed to feel no fear. She went right up to the snarling dog in her jauntiest way, raised herself on her tiny hind legs, and cheekily dabbed her nose on its nose. The other dog started back, so surprised that it stopped snarling, then pricked up its lumpy ears and, very cautiously, nosed Waif in return. Waif gave an excited squeak and frisked. Next second, both dogs were gamboling delightedly all around the library. "Well," said the king, "I suppose that's all right then. What's the meaning of this, Jamal? Why are you here instead of Sim?" Jamal, who had only one eye, Charmaine noticed, came and apologetically put his tray down on the table. "Our princes have taken Sim away to receive the guests, sire," he explained, "leaving no one but me to bring food, and my dog would come, I think," he added, watching the two dogs prancing. I think that my dog has never enjoyed life until now," he bowed to Charmaine. "Please, bring your small white dog here again often, Miss Charming." He whistled to his dog. It pretended not to hear. He went to the door and whistled again. "Food," he said. "Come for squid." This time both dogs came, and to Charmaine's surprise and dismay, Waif went trotting out the door beside the cook's dog, and the door shut after them both. "Oh, not to worry," the king said. "They seem to be friends. Jamal will bring him back. Very reliable fellow, Jamal. If it wasn't for that dog of his, he'd be the perfect cook. Let's see what he's brought us, shall we?" Jamal had brought a jug of lemonade and a platter piled with crisp brown things under a white cloth. The king said, "Ah," as he eagerly lifted the cloth. "Have one while they're hot." Charmaine did so. One bite was enough to assure her that Jamal was an even better cook than her father, and Mr. Baker was renowned for being the best cook in town. The brown things were crunchy but soft at the same time, with rather a hot taste that Charmaine had never met before. They made you need the lemonade. She and the king polished off the whole platterful between them and drank all of the lemonade. Then they got back to work. "Oh, I forgot my blessing." "Hello, how are you, little girl?" "Hello." So I realized after I was done reading last time that I pulled out Evie, who is a brown, but I do have a white fox. His name is Miles. But since Waif is a white dog and not a brown dog, I decided I should probably have a white plushie. By this time, they were on extremely friendly terms. Charmaine now had no shyness about asking the king anything that she wanted to know. "Why would they need 2 bushels of rose petals, sire?" she asked him, and the king answered, "Oh, they liked them underfoot in the dining saloon in those days. Messy habit to my mind. Ooh, listen to what this philosopher has to say about camels, my dear." And he read out a page from his book that made them both laugh. The philosopher had clearly not got on with camels. Quite a long while later, the library door opened and Waif trotted in, looking very pleased with herself. She was followed by Jamal. "A message from our princess, sire," he said. "The lady has settled in, and Sim is taking tea to the front parlor." "Huh. Crumpets? Muffins, too," Jamal said, and went away. The king banged his book shut and stood up. "I had better go and greet our guest," he said. "Well, I'll go on with the bills then," Charmaine said. "I'll make a pile of the ones that I want to ask about." No. You come too. You come too, my dear. And bring the little dog. Helps break the ice, you know. This lady is my daughter's friend. Never met her myself." Charmaine at once felt highly nervous again. She'd found Princess Hilda thoroughly intimidating and much too royal for comfort, and any friend of hers was likely to be just as bad. But she could hardly refuse when the king was expectantly holding the door open for her. Waif was already trotting after him. Charmaine felt forced to get up and follow. The front parlor was a large room full of faded sofas with slightly frayed arms and rather ragged fringes. There were more pale squares on the walls where pictures must have once hung. The biggest pale square was over the grand marble fireplace, where, to Charmaine's relief, a cheerful fire was burning. The parlor, like the library, was a cold room, and Charmaine had gone cold with nerves again. Princess Hilda was sitting bolt upright on a sofa beside the fireplace, where Sim had just pushed a large tea trolley. As soon as she saw Sim pushing a trolley, Charmaine knew where she had seen Sim before. It was when she had gotten lost beside the conference room and had that glimpse of the old man pushing a trolley along a strange corridor. "That's odd," she thought. Sim was in the act of shakily placing a plate of buttered crumpets in the hearth. At the sight of those crumpets, Waif's nose quivered, and she made a dash towards them. Charmaine was only just in time to catch her. As she stood up, holding the wriggling Waif firmly in both arms, the princess said, "Ah, my father, the king." Everyone else in the parlor stood up. "Father," said the princess, "may I introduce my great friend, Mrs. Sophie Pendragon." The king strode limpingly forwards, holding his hand out and making the large room look quite a little smaller. Charmaine had not realized before quite how large he was. Quite as tall as those elves, she thought. "Ah, Mrs. Pendragon," he said, "delighted to meet you. Any friend of my daughter's is a friend of ours." Mrs. Pendragon surprised Charmaine. She was quite young, younger than the princess by a long way, and modestly dressed in a peacock blue that set off her gold hair and blue-green eyes to perfection. "Oh, she's lovely," Charmaine thought, rather enviously. Mrs. Pendragon dropped the king a little curtsy as they shook hands and said, "I'm here to do my best, sire. More I can't say." "Oh, quite right, the king replied. "Please, be seated again, everyone, and let's have some tea." Everyone sat down, and a polite, courteous hum of conversation began, while Sim doddered around giving out cups of tea. Charmaine felt a complete outsider. Feeling sure that she should not be here, she sat herself in the corner of the most distant sofa, and tried to work out who the other people were. Waif, meanwhile, sat sedately on the sofa beside Charmaine, looking demure. Her eyes keenly followed the gentleman who was handing round the crumpets. This gentleman was so quiet and colourless that Charmaine forgot what he looked like as soon as she took her eyes off of him, and had to look at him again to remind herself. The other gentleman, the one whose mouth looked closed even when he was talking, she gathered was the king's chancellor. He seemed to have a lot of secretive things to say to Mrs. Pendragon, who kept nodding and then blinking a bit, as if what the Chancellor had said surprised her. The other lady, who was elderly, seemed to be Princess Hilda's lady-in-waiting and was very good about talking about the weather. And I shouldn't be surprised if it didn't rain again tonight, she was saying, as the colorless gentleman arrived beside Charmaine and offered her a crumpet. Waif's nose swiveled yearningly to follow the plate. "Oh, thanks," Charmaine said, pleased that he had not forgotten her. "Oh, take two," suggested the colorless gentleman. "His Majesty will certainly eat any that are left over." The king at that moment was eating two muffins, one squashed on top of the other, and was watching the crumpets as eagerly as Waif was. Charmaine thanked the gentleman again and took two. They were the most buttery crumpets that she had ever encountered. Waif's nose swiveled to dab gently against Charmaine's hand. All right, Charmaine muttered, trying to break off a piece without dripping butter on the sofa. Butter ran down her fingers and threatened to trickle up her sleeves. She was trying to get rid of it on her handkerchief when the lady-in-waiting finished saying all that anyone could possibly say about weather and turned to Mrs. Pendragon. "Princess Hilda tells me that you have a charming little boy," she said. "Yes, Morgan," said Mrs. Pendragon. She seemed to be having trouble with the butter, too, and was mopping her fingers with her handkerchief and looking flustered. "How old will Morgan be now, Sophie?" Princess Hilda asked. "When I saw him, he was just a baby." "Oh, nearly 2, Mrs. Pendragon replied, catching a big golden drip of butter before it fell on her skirt. I left him with... But the door of the parlor opened. Through it came a small fat toddler in a grubby blue suit with tears rolling down his face. Mama. He was wailing as he staggered into the room. But as soon as he saw Mrs. Pendragon, his face spread into a blinding smile. He stretched out both arms and rushed over to her, where he buried his face in her skirt. "Mom!" he shouted. Following him through the door came floating an agitated-looking blue creature shaped like a long teardrop with a face in the front of it. It seemed to be made of flames. It brought a gust of warmth with it, and a gasp from everyone in the room, and an even more agitated housemaid hurried in after it. After the housemaid came a small boy, quite the most angelic child Charmaine had ever seen. He had a mass of blonde curls that clustered around his angelic pink and white face. His eyes were big and blue and bashful. His exquisite little chin rested on a frill of white lace, and the rest of his graceful little body was clothed in a pale blue velvet suit with big silver buttons. His pink rosebud mouth spread into a shy smile as he came in, showing a charming dimple in his delicate little cheek. Charmaine could not think why Mrs. Pendragon was staring at him in such horror. He was surely a truly enchanting child. And what long, curly eyelashes. "With my husband and his fire demon," Mrs. Pendragon finished. Her face had gone a fiery red, and she glared at the little boy across the toddler's head. So we are on page 181. And we have till 204. So I can read another 200 pages tonight. I can read another 20 pages tonight. Pesky decimal point. Chapter 8, in which Peter has trouble with the plumbing. "Oh, ma'am, sire," the housemaid gasped. "I had to let them in. The little one was so upset." She said this into a room full of confusion. Everyone stood up, and someone dropped a teacup. Sim plunged to rescue the cup, and the king dove past him to pick up the plate of crumpets. Mrs. Pendragon stood up with Morgan in her arms, still looking daggers at the small boy, while the blue teardrop creature bobbed in front of her face. "It's not my fault, Sophie," it kept saying in an agitated, crackling voice. "I swear it's not my fault. We couldn't stop Morgan from crying for you." Princess Hilda rose quellingly to her feet. "You may go," she said to the housemaid. "There is no need for anyone to be upset. Sophie, dear, I had no idea you didn't employ a nursemaid." "No, I don't, and I was hoping for a break," Mrs. Pendragon said. "You would think," she added, glowering at the angelic little boy, "that a wizard and a fire demon could manage one small toddler between them." "Men," said the princess. "I have no opinion of men's ability to manage anything. Of course, Morgan and the other little boy must be our guests too, now that they're here. What sort of accommodation does a fire demon require?" she asked the colourless gentleman. He looked completely blank. "Well, I'd appreciate a good log fire," the fire demon crackled. "I see that you have a nice one in this room. That's all I need. I'm Calcifer, by the way, ma'am." The princess and the colourless gentleman both looked relieved. The princess said, "Oh, yes, of course. I believe we met briefly in Ingrid 2 years ago." "And who is this other little fellow?" the king asked genially. "Sophie's my auntie," the small boy answered, in a sweet, lisping voice, raising his angelic face and big blue eyes to the king's. "Pleased to meet you," the king said. "And what's your name, my little man?" "Twinkle," the little boy whispered, coyly ducking his curly blonde head. "Have a crumpet, Twinkle," the king said, heartily, holding the plate out. "Thank you," Twinkle said, devoutly, taking a crumpet. At this, Morgan held out a fat, imperious hand and boomed, "Me, me, me, me!" until the king gave him a crumpet too. Mrs. Pendragon sat Morgan on the sofa to eat it. Sim looked around and resourcefully fetched a cloth from the trolley. It became soaked in butter almost at once. Morgan beamed up at Sim, the princess, the lady-in-waiting, and the chancellor, with his face all shiny. "Dump it," he said. "Good, dump it." While this was going on, Charmaine became aware that Mrs. Pendragon had somehow trapped little Twinkle behind the sofa that she was sitting on. She could not help but overhear Mrs. Pendragon demanding, "What do you think you're doing, Howl?" She sounded so fierce that Waif jumped into Charmaine's lap and cowered there. "He forgot to invite me," Twinkle's sweet little voice replied. "That filly. You can't sort out this mess on your own, Sophie. You need me." "No, I do not," Sophie retorted. "And do you have to have a lisp like that?" "Yes," said Twinkle. said Sophie. "It's not funny, Howl, and you've dragged Morgan here." "I'll tell you," Twinkle interrupted her. "Morgan did not stop crying from the moment you left. Ask Calcifer if you don't believe me." "Calcifer's as bad as you are," Sophie said passionately. "I don't believe either of you so much as tried to stop him. Did you? You were just looking for an excuse to launch this masquerade on poor Princess Hilda." "She needs us, Sophie," Twinkle said earnestly. Charmaine was quite fascinated by this conversation, but unfortunately, Morgan looked round for his mother just then and spotted Waif trembling on Charmaine's knee. He gave a loud cry of, "Goggy!" slid off the sofa, trampling the cloth as he went, and rushed at Waif with both buttery hands out. Waif jumped desperately onto the back of the sofa, where he stood and yapped like a shrill version of something with a hacking cough. Charmaine was forced to pick Waif up and back away out of Morgan's reach, so that all she heard next of the strange conversation behind the sofa was Mrs. Pendragon saying something about sending Twinkle, or was his name Howl, to bed without supper, and Twinkle daring her to "Just quiet." As Waif quieted down, Twinkle said wistfully, "Don't you think I'm pretty at all?" There was a strange hollow thump then, as if Mrs. Pendragon had so far forgotten good behavior as to stamp her foot. "Yes," Charmaine heard her say. "Disgustingly pretty." "Well," said Princess Hilda over near the fire, while Charmaine was still backing away from Morgan, Things certainly are lively with children around. Sim, give Morgan a muffin. Quickly. Morgan at once reversed direction and ran towards Sim and the muffins. Charmaine heard her own hair frizzle. She looked around and found the fire demon hovering beside her shoulder, looking at her with flaming orange eyes. "Who are you?" the demon said. Charmaine's heart thumped a little, although Waif seemed perfectly calm. If I hadn't just met a Lubbock, Charmaine thought, I'd be quite frightened of this Calcifer. I'm only the temporary help in the library, she said. Oh, then we'll need to talk to you later, Calcifer crackled. You reek of magic, did you know? You and your dog. Well, she's not my dog. She belongs to the wizard, Charmaine said. Oh, this Wizard Norland who seems to have messed things up? Calcifer asked. Well, I don't think Great Uncle William messed things up. He's a deer. Oh, he seems to have looked in all the wrong places, Calcifer said. You don't need to be a nasty to make a mess. Look at Morgan. And he whisked away. He had this way, Charmaine thought, of vanishing in one place and turning up in another, like a dragonfly flicking about over a pond. The king came across to Charmaine, jovially wiping his hands on a large, crisp napkin. Better get back to work, my dear. We have to tidy up for the night. Oh, yes, of course, sire, Charmaine said, and followed him towards the door. Before they got there, the angelic Twinkle somehow escaped from the angry Mrs. Pendragon and pulled on the sleeve of the lady-in-waiting. Please, he asked charmingly, do you have any toys? The lady looked nonplussed. I don't play with toys, my dear, she said. Morgan caught the word from her. Doi, he shouted, waving both arms with a buttery muffin clutched in one fist. Doi, 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 doi! A jack-in-the-box landed in front of Morgan, busting its lid open so that the jack popped out with a boing. A large dollhouse crashed down beside it, followed by a shower of elderly teddy bears. An instant later, a shabby rocking horse established itself next to the tea trolley, and Morgan shouted with delight. I think we'll leave my daughter to cope with the guests, the king said, ushering Charmaine and Waif out of the parlor. He shut the door upon more and more toys appearing, and the child Twinkle looking highly demure, while everyone else ran about in confusion. Opal, come here. Giant fox. Waif is big again. Here you go. I can't reach you from there. Right there. Right there. Love you. You're a good girl. You're a good girl and I love you very much. Hello. He shut the door upon more and more toys appearing, and the child Twinkle looking highly demure, while everyone else ran about in confusion. Wizards are often very vigorous guests, the king remarked on the way back to the library, though I had no idea that they started so young. A bit trying for their mothers, I imagine. Half an hour later, Charmaine was on her way back to Great Uncle William's house, with Waif pattering along behind her, looking as demure as the child Twinkle. Charmaine said to her, You know, Waif, I've never lived so much in my life as these 3 days, ever. Or I've never lived so much of my life in 3 days, ever. She felt a bit wistful all the same. It made sense for the king to give her the bills and love letters, but she did wish that they could have taken turns with the books. Oh, bottom book cover got messed up a little bit. She would have loved to spend some of the day at least going through a thoroughly elderly and musty leather-bound volume, is what she'd been hoping for, but never mind. As soon as she got back to Great Uncle William's house, She would bury herself in the 12-branched wand, or perhaps Memoirs of an Exorcist would be better, since it seemed to be the kind of book that you were happier to read by daylight. Or try a different book altogether, maybe. She was looking forward so much to a good read that she hardly noticed the walk, except to pick Waif up again when Waif began panting and toiling. With Waif in her arms, she kicked Great Uncle William's gate open and found herself confronting Rollo halfway up the path, scowling all over his small blue face. "What is it now?" Charmaine said to him, and seriously wondered whether to pick Rollo up too and throw him into the hydrangeas. Rollo was small enough to hurl beautifully, even when she had one arm wrapped around Waif. "Them flowerheads you got all over that outside table," Rollo said. "You expect me to stick 'em back on or something?" No, of course not," Charmaine said. "They're drying in the sun, then I'll have them in the house." "Huh," said Rollo. "Prettifying in there, are you? Now do you think the wizard will like that?" "Well, that's none of your business," Charmaine said haughtily, and strode forward so that Rollo was forced to hop out of her way. He shouted something after her as she was opening the front door, but she did not bother to listen. She knew it was rude. She slammed the door shut on his yells. Indoors, the smell of the living room was more than musty. It was like a stagnant pond. Charmaine had put Waif on the floor and sniffed suspiciously. And so did Waif. Long brown fingers of something were oozing under the door to the kitchen. Waif tiptoed up to them warily. Charmaine, equally warily, put out her toe and prodded the nearest brown trickle. It squished like a marsh. "Oh, what has Peter done now?" Charmaine exclaimed. She flung the door open, and 2 inches of water rippled all over the kitchen floor. Charmaine could see it seeping darkly up the 6 bags of laundry beside the sink. "Ugh!" She cried out, slammed the door shut, opened it again, and turned left. The corridor there was awash. Sunlight from the end window flared onto the water in the way that suggested a strong current coming from the bathroom. Angrily, Charmaine splashed her way there. "All I wanted was to sit down and read a book," she thought, "and I come home to a flood." As she reached the bathroom with Waif paddling unhappily after her, its door opened, and Peter shot out of it, damp down his front and looking thoroughly harassed. He had no shoes on, and his trousers were rolled up to his knees. "Oh good, you're back," he said, before Charmaine could speak. "There's this hole in one of the pipes in there. I've tried 6 different spells to stop it, but all they do is make it move about. I was just about to turn the water off that woolly tank through there, or try anyway, but perhaps you could do something instead?" "Woolly tank?" Charmaine said. "Oh, you mean that thing covered in blue fur. What makes you think that will do any good? Everywhere's flooded." "That's the only thing I haven't tried," Peter snarled at her. "The water has to come from there somehow. You can hear it trickling. I thought I might find a stopcock." "Oh, you're useless," Charmaine snarled back. "Let me have a look." She pushed Peter aside and flounced into the bathroom, raising a sheet of water as she went. There was indeed a hole. One of the pipes between the wash basin and the bath had lengthwise slit in it, and water was spraying out of it in a merry fountain. Here and there along the pipe were gray magical-looking blobs, which must have been Peter's 6 useless spells. This was all his fault, she snarled to herself. He was the only one who made pipes red hot. Oh, honestly. She rushed at the spraying slit and angrily planted both hands on it. "Stop this," she commanded. Water sprayed out around her hands and onto her face. "Stop it at once!" All that happened was that the slit moved sideways from under her fingers for about 6 inches and sprayed water over her pigtail and her right shoulder. Charmaine scooped her hands along to cover it again. "Stop that! Stop that!" The slit moved off sideways again. "So that's what you want, is it?" Charmaine said to it, and scooped it along some more. The slit moved off. She followed it with her hands. In a moment or so, she had it cornered above the bath, and the water sprayed harmlessly into the bath and running away down the plug hole. She kept it there by leaning on the pipe with one hand, while she thought of what to do next. "I wonder Peter didn't think of this," she thought in a sort of mutter, instead of running about casting useless spells. "Great Uncle William," she called out. "How do I stop the bathroom pipe leaking?" There was no answer. This was obviously not something that Great Uncle William had thought that Charmaine would need to know. "I don't think he knows much about plumbing," Peter said from the doorway. "There's nothing useful in the suitcase either. I had it all out to sea." "Oh, did you?" Charmaine said nastily. Yes, some of the stuff in there is really interesting, Peter said. I'll show you if you... Oh, be quiet and let me think. Charmaine snapped at him. Peter seemed to realize that Charmaine might not be in a very good mood. He stopped talking and waited while Charmaine stood in the bath and leaned on the pipe, thinking, You had to come at this leak 2 ways so it couldn't slide off again. First you fixed it in one place and then you covered it up. But how? Well, quick, before my feet are quite soaked. Peter, go and get me some dishcloths, at least 3. Why, you don't think... Now, said Charmaine. And to her relief, Peter went crossly splashing off, muttering about bossy, bad-tempered cats. Charmaine pretended not to hear. Meanwhile, she dared not let go of the slit, and the slit kept spraying, and she was getting wetter every second. Oh, blast that Peter! She put another hand on the farther end of the slit, and began pushing and sliding her hands together as hard as she could. Close up, she ordered the pipe. Stop leaking and close up! Water spouted rudely in her face. She could feel the slit trying to dodge, but she refused to let it. She pushed and she pushed. I can do magic, she thought at the pipe. I worked a spell. I can make you close up. So close up! And it worked. By the time Peter came wading back with just 2 cloths, saying those were all that he could find, Charmaine was soaked through to her underclothes. But the pipe was whole again. Charmaine took the cloths and bound them around the pipe on either side where the slit had been. Then she snatched up the long black brush from beside the bath, this being the only thing remotely like a wizard's staff that she could see, and batted at the cloths with it. Stay there, and don't you dare move, she told the cloths. She batted at the mended slit. You stay shut, she told it, or it'll be worse for you. After that, she turned back the brush. After that, she turned the back brush on Peter's blobby gray spells and batted at them too. Go! Go away! You're useless! And they all obediently vanished. Charmaine, flushed with a sense of great power, batted at the hot tap beside her knees. Run hot again, she told it. Let's have no nonsense. And you, she added, reaching across to bat at the hot tap on the wash basin. Both hot, but not too hot, or I'll give you grief. But you stay running cold, she instructed the cold taps, batting at them. Hello, baby girl. I am not grumpy at you. I am being grumpy in the book, in the context of the story. You are a very good girl. And you, go! Go on, dry up, drain away, go, or else! Peter waded over to the wash basin, turned the hot tap on, and held his hand under it. It's warm, he said. You really did it. Oh, that's a relief. Thanks. Huh, said Charmaine, soaked and cold and grumpy. Now I'm going to change into dry clothes and read a book. Peter asked, rather pathetically, Aren't you going to help me mop up then? Charmaine did not see why she should, but her eyes fell on poor Waif, struggling towards her with water lapping at her underside. It did not look as if the back brush had worked on all the floors. All right, she said. But I have done a day's work already, you know. So have I, Peter said feelingly. I was rushing about all day trying to stop that pipe from leaking. Let's get the kitchen dry at least. As the fire was still leaping and crackling in the kitchen grate, it was not unlike a steam bath in there. Charmaine waded through the tepid water and opened the window. Apart from the mysteriously multiplying laundry bags, which were sodden everywhere but the floor was dry. This included the suitcase open on the table. Behind Charmaine, Peter spoke strange words, and Waif whimpered. Charmaine whirled around to find Peter with his arms stretched out, little flames flickering on them from his fingers to his shoulders. Dry, O waters on the floor, he intoned, and flames began to flicker across his hair and down his damp front, too. His face changed from smug to alarmed. Oh dear, he said. As he said this, the flames rippled all over him, and he began to burn quite fiercely. By then, he looked plain frightened. It's hot! Help! Charmaine rushed at him, seized one of his blazing arms, and pushed him over into the water on the floor. But this did no good at all. Charmaine stared at the extraordinary sight of flames flickering away under the water and simmering bubbles appearing all around Peter where the water was starting to boil, and hauled him up again, double quick, in a shower of hot water and steam. "Cancel it!" she shouted, snatching her hands off of his hot sleeve. "What spell did you use?" "I don't know," Peter wailed. "What spell?" Charmaine bawled at him. "It's the spell to stop floods in the Book of Palimpsest," Peter babbled, "and I've no idea how to cancel it." "Oh, you're so stupid," Charmaine cried out. She grabbed him by one flaming shoulder and shook him. "Cancel spell!" she shouted. "Out! Spell, I order you to cancel at once!" And the spell obeyed her. Charmaine stopped shaking her scorched hand and watched the flames vanish in a sizzle, a cloud of steam, and a wet, singeing smell. It left Peter looking brown and frizzled all over. His face and hands were bright pink, and his hair was noticeably shorter. "Thanks," he said, flopping over with relief. Charmaine pushed him upright. "Phew! I smell of burned hair. How can you be so stupid? What other spells have you been doing?" "Nothing," Peter said, raking burned bits out of his hair. Charmaine was fairly sure that he was lying, but if he was, Peter was not going to confess. "It wasn't that stupid," he argued. "Look at the floor." Charmaine looked down to see that the water had mostly gone. The floor was once again simply tiles, wet, shiny, and steaming, but not flooded any longer. "Then you've been very lucky," she said. "I mostly am," Peter said. "My mother always says that too, whenever I do a spell that goes wrong. I think I'm going to have to change into different clothes." "Me too," Charmaine said. They went through the inner door where Peter tried to turn right, and Charmaine pushed him to his left so that they went straight and arrived in the living room. The wet trickles on the carpet there were steaming and drying out rapidly, but the room still smelled horrible. Charmaine snorted, turned Peter round, and pushed him left through the door again. Here the corridor was damp, but not full of water any longer. "See," Peter said as he went into his bedroom. "It did work." "Huh," Charmaine said, going into her own room. "I wonder what else he's done. I don't trust him an inch." Her best clothes were a wet mess. Charmaine took them off sadly and hung them around the room to get dry. And nothing was going to cure the big scorch mark down the front of her best jacket. She would have to wear ordinary clothes tomorrow when she went to the royal mansion. And do I dare leave Peter alone here? She wondered. I bet he'll spend the time experimenting with spells. I know I would. She shrugged a little as she realized that she was no better than Peter, really. She'd been quite unable to resist the spells in the Book of Palimpsest either. She was feeling much more kindly towards Peter when she came back to the kitchen, dry again, except for her hair, and wearing her oldest clothes and her slippers. "Find out how to ask for dinner," Peter said, as Charmaine put her wet clothes to dry on the hearth. "I'm starving." He was looking much more comfortable in his old blue suit than that he had arrived in. "There's food in the bag Mother brought yesterday," Charmaine said, busily arranging the shoes in the best place. "No, there isn't," Peter said. "I ate it all for lunch." Charmaine stopped feeling kindly towards Peter. "You greedy pig," she said, banging on the fireplace for food for Waif. Waif, in spite of all of the crumpets she had eaten in the royal mansion, was delighted to see the latest dog dish. "Yeah, that's you. Yeah, that's you, my little sweetheart. Oh. Yeah, you think about food all the time. I love you. I love you, baby. Almost done. And so are you, a greedy little pig," Charmaine said, watching Waif gobble. "Where do you put it all? Great Uncle William, how do we get supper?" The kindly voice was very faint now. "Just knock on the pantry door and say, 'Supper, my dear.'" Peter got to the pantry first. "Supper!" he bellowed, banging hard on the floor or on the door. There was a knobbly flopping sound from the table. Both of them whirled round to look. There, laying beside the open suitcase, were a small lamb chop, 2 onions, and a turnip. Charmaine and Peter stared at them. "They're all raw," Peter said, stunned. "Not enough, anyway," Charmaine said. "Do you know how to cook it?" "No. My mother does all the cooking in our house. Oh, honestly. And for the record, we have probably read one of my very favorite lines in this book. Let's see if I can find it again. Who's that? Twinkle said wistfully, "Don't you think I'm pretty at all?" "Yes, disgustingly pretty." So, anyway, I am being summoned to a bedtime, and that means that I must tell you good night. So, but first, I will let you know that we are on page 204 out of 404. We are precisely in the middle. So, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate without knowing a thing about you, then I can love you for exactly the same reason. So, sleep well, dearest. I love you.